Rolling, you ready, Gil?
Yeah.
All right. Mr. President, I've heard that at one point you went to see General Marshall and wanted to get back in the field artillery. Is that right?
I said, I'm 56. He said, Senator, you're too damned old. You go on back and stay in the Senate. I said, I'm 4 years younger than you are. He said, yes, but I'm already in. So I went back. Duty on the Supreme Court, and his action as one of the main staff of the President in the White House. I had a wonderful nominating speech already for him, but I never got to make it.
Another example of a president who can make people do what he wants them to do, was it?
Yes, whether he wanted to do it or not, and he knew I didn't want to do it.
It was his feeling, perhaps, that, on one occasion he came back and reported to the nation before he reported to you.
He intended to, but he didn't get to do it, for I sent for him and made him report to me first.
Let's hold it for this moment, Andrew.
Efficient and very effective, and its direction under Edgar Hoover has been in the right line. They've never tried to make a Gestapo out of it. They've tried to protect the government of the United States and to run down interstate criminals and automobile thefts and kidnappings and things of that sort, and they've been very successful at it.
Into the political affiliations of government employees who are in non-sensitive jobs?
I think government employees ought to have exactly the same liberties that the first 10 amendments of the Constitution guarantee. And I've said time and again that I thought the Un-American Activities Committee in the House of Representatives is about the most un-American thing in America.
Did you
orders, and he had acted that way in several instances, not only with me, but with President Roosevelt. And I stood it as long as I could, and I made up my mind the best thing to do with him was to give him the McClellan treatment, that was to retire him.
And just how did you go about that? What were the steps involved?
Well, I called in the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and the Ambassador at Large on the Marshall Plan and the 4.4 program. That was Averell Harriman and General Bradley, General Marshall, and Dean Acheson. And asked them what the situation, how the situation would develop on this second letter to Joe Martin, who was the leader of the minority in the House. And Dean Acheson made the statement that he thought it would be a bad thing to relieve General Marshall because he was immensely popular and the people in the Far East thought he was next door to the Almighty and they might feel that we were falling down on what we were trying to do. General Marshall said he hoped I'd postpone the situation. I didn't tell them what I had in my mind. I told them to come back in 2 days, or the next morning, I forget which it was, and they came back, and General Marshall had read all the messages by that time, and he made the statement to me. He said, Mr. President, you ought to fire him 2 years ago, or at least 6 months ago, he said. And I then discussed the matter with the other people. Dean Acheson still thought it was poor politics and bad business to fire him. And then I issued the order, had General Marshall write the order out himself in longhand, which was to be forwarded to Frank Pace, who was Secretary for the Army and who was then in Korea. We couldn't reach Frank Pace at all. And General Bradley came over to see me early Monday morning. This all happened on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. General Bradley came to see me and said that some Tribune reporter had obtained a leak in the Pentagon, and he thought the whole thing would be released. Well, I said, send a direct message to the general and tell him he's relieved. But inform him also that if we'd been able to get hold of Frank Pace, we'd have had it delivered in person. And that's how the whole thing came about. I have to do that to a man who's been in the military service for 51 years, but he brought it on himself, and it had to be done because the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and that means the control of the armed forces of this republic are under civilians instead of under military men, and I had to exercise that prerogative just as Lincoln and James K. Polk and other presidents have done.
Mr. President, when you were in the White House, how did you handle your speech-making arrangements?
Well, when it was necessary to make a speech of national or international importance, or even just a speech for the information of the people, I'd sit down with the staff and inform them what I had in mind and make an outline of what we proposed to do. And they'd draw up a document and bring it in for consideration. And that document would be gone over and written and rewritten and marked and slashed, and sometimes as many as 6 drafts would be made of it before it was ready for use. Then it'd be put into a reading copy, inserted in a book, in a loose-leaf book. And usually the newspaper men found it necessary always to be present because they were never right sure that what was in the record as delivered to them was going to be said by me in the delivery of the speech.
What was the most difficult speech you had to make in terms of the polishing and the refinement of it?
Well, I think the most difficult one that I had to make was the first message that I took to the Congress on Monday after the death of President Roosevelt. I think that was the most difficult one. They're all difficult as far as that's concerned, because any utterance of the President is of vital importance not only to his own nation but to the whole world. And what he has to say, particularly about international affairs, has to be carefully considered and reconsidered, and then sometimes it comes out in a manner which he does not mean that it should, which can't help that. That's due to the fact that everybody doesn't understand the same kind of English in this country or Britain or anywhere else.
Do you remember what you said when you first came out of the White House after you learned of Mr. Roosevelt's death? When you asked people to pray for you?
That was down in the Senate when I had paid a visit to the Senate afterwards. I told them that if anybody needed the prayers of the people in the country, now is the time to use them, that I certainly needed them, because it was a tremendous responsibility which had fallen on me, as if I'd landed under a load of hay on the farm and couldn't get out, but I was going to get out, and did.
Do you believe in the efficacy of prayer?
I certainly do. I certainly do.
You had a rather checkered relationship with John L. Lewis, didn't you?
Yes. John L. Lewis is a strong character, and he's a leader of his coal miners, and they have great confidence in him. And he made an attempt, just as MacArthur did, to run the presidency of the United States, and he didn't succeed in it. He had to be told exactly where to get off. He understood it, and he knew that was what had happened, that there was a man in the White House that could make it happen, and I did make it happen, and we were the best of friends. We've never had any personal falling out on the matter.
How would you describe the basic issue between you on that occasion?
Well, it was a case of the president's powers to act in the case of the coal strike. And I exercised those powers just as I was trying to exercise them in the steel strike later on. And I was sustained in that matter, and the lower courts and the Supreme Court sustained me in that action.
Did you ever do anything when you were irked, shall we say? Criticism of your family is ruled out.
That's right.
Mr. President, when did you start this practice of early morning walks?
Well, I started that practice when I was on the county court of Jackson County. I used to walk to the courthouse and walk back home when I was having lunch at home. Then when I was in the Senate, I'd get up every morning and be down at the Senate office building at 7 or 7:30, and then if there were any secretaries there, sometimes there were and sometimes there were not, I'd dictate a bunch of mail and then go out and take a walk. If they weren't there, I'd go and take a walk and then come back and dictate the mail. And then I got in the habit, when we moved over on Connecticut Avenue at 4701, of taking a walk before breakfast. And I walked all over that part of Washington, usually about 2 miles at 120 steps a minute.
I wonder if in your whole period of time in the White House, you could name the 3 or 4 or 5 advisors who were most useful, perhaps indispensable to you.
Well, it's a very difficult matter to confine it to 4 or 5. I had a number of wonderful men, not only in the House and the Senate, but in the cabinet and on the staff, in whom I had the utmost confidence and who never violated that confidence. To give you an example, in 1950, I think it was, or 1951, down at Key West with all the staff present and one or two cabinet members, I wrote a statement in which I said I would not be a candidate for re-election in 1952. It was a year and a half or 2 years before that. And I read it to the staff. Of course, they almost fainted and said it couldn't possibly happen. There was never one peep about that statement until it was issued by me on the 29th of March, 1952. So that shows that I had a staff and a cabinet on whom I could completely rely at that time. That was 1950 or 51. I'd have to look up the date. It's in Bill Hillman's book.
Mr. President, have you ever been tempted to go back to the Senate?
After that they had more letters against that program than they had for it. And I said, well, Pete, you can't lie about a man for 10 years and then change it all by one editorial.
Well together?
Always. We never had any disagreements at all.
Was your mother or your father the disciplinarian in the family, so
Both.
you and your brother?
Both were. They were both. Mother did most of the spanking, but whenever our father took a notion to spank us, we knew it was going to be a good one.
Were they pretty strict?
Yes, they were. They made us walk the chalk line of what they thought was right, and what they thought was right, I think, was right. They taught us respect for our elders, principally. We were not allowed to talk in what we call a saucy manner to any of the elder people in the family, and if we did, that was sure sign for a spanking.
What were your Sundays like in those days, Mr. President?
Well, we went to Sunday school every Sunday after we were old enough to go, and that was after we moved to Independence. When I was 6 years old, we went to Presbyterian Sunday school all the time. And that's where I met Ms. Truman, and she was 5 and I was 6.
Speaking of Mrs. Truman, did you consult and confer with her on the tough decisions when you were in the White House?
Oh, yes, she was always in my confidence, and she was, while I was United States Senator, she acted as a secretary for me, and always edited my speeches, even after I was in the White House, and her advice on those was always good. She does it yet.
Do you remember the most severe disciplinary action taken against you when you were a youngster, Mr. President?
Well, I was one of these fraidy cats who usually obeyed the rules, and they didn't have to get after me very often. But I remember once when we were 3 and 5 years old out on the farm, I had a little red wagon, and another little boy and my brother would ride in the wagon, and I'd take them into a mud hole and dump them in it. And then they'd do the same thing for me. That's the best spanking I ever got in my life.
Since then, a lot of people have been dumping you in mud holes, and you've been dumping them. Is that right?
Well, it's gone. That's right. But I was never very much on the side of disobeying the rules, even when I was growing up. But whenever I did, I got plenty calmed down for it, and usually got a good licking for it by my mother. I don't think my father ever did give me a whipping. He scolded me many times, which is almost as bad.
Did you say grace at meals when you were young?
Yes, always. I didn't, but
Yes.
the family did. Always.
What kind of grace was it?
A Baptist grace, like they always say.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a selfish one, as has been told about the old New Englander who had the company and called on the Lord to bless him and his wife and his son and his wife, and the fellow at the table said, if you don't include me, I guess I'll have to leave, which he did. We were not that stingy with our blessings.
When did you first get interested in serious reading, in biography particularly?
Well, I began to read everything I could, I'd imagine, when I was in about the 2nd grade in school. By the time I was 11 years old, I'd read the old big Bible at home through twice. And I then took an interest in the biography of the heroes and the prophets of the Old Testament, and began to read these books in the Independence Public Library on the biographies of the various men who had made history in the world. And it's the most interesting thing there is, at least it was to me. not the slightest bit bothersome to me.
Were you a good student in school? Or just
Well, I was considered a fairly good student. I went through the 11 grades in the independent school in 9 years.
What's your clearest memory on the World War II? World War I, I'm sorry.
World War I, well, the thing that I remember most with the least satisfaction was one evening we were marching from one battlefront to another, and we'd stop every little while for a rest. The colonel came along and caught my battery sitting down. He made them all stand up and took them down the road at double time, and then informed me that I was to march in at double time for the rest of the night. That was a very humiliating thing, and he and I had some words on which he could have court-martialed me, but I marched the battery down the road out of the sight and took him up the side road and let him go to sleep. Then marched in on time the next morning, and he wanted to know where I'd been, and I said I'd got lost. I got lost and let the boys go to sleep. Wasn't any use in marching those boys like that with their packs on. I just wouldn't do it. That's all there was to it. That's the saddest experience I had. Another experience that was one of great humiliation was up in the Vosges Mountains. We were taken from our regular battery positions to old French positions to fire a barrage of 500 rounds of gas over into the German lines. And before my battery could move out, the sergeant in charge gave the wrong flank to the battery, and it went down and got stuck in a mud hole. My horse fell down and rolled over me. And by the time I got up, the return fire had come. And the sergeant lost his nerve, and he said, "Run, fellas, run. They've got a braggadons," and they scattered like a bunch of partridges. Well, I got them all assembled and got them out without anybody being hurt, but they killed about 6 of my horses. That's the most humiliating experience I had in the whole war.
What was the most satisfying?
Well, the most satisfactory experience was after that, whenever the barrage to be fired, I always stood behind the battery, and there never was any of them that ever tried to get out from under fire. That was the baptism in fire that caused this, and it happens time and again. Frederick the Great himself ran off the battlefield the first time he was ever in one.
Did he indeed?
Yes, indeed.
Where was that?
That was at one of those battles in East Germany when he was not quite so powerful. When he'd just come to the throne, got into that first war with Austria, I think, and the general caught his horse and kept him from completely leaving the field. Read the history of Frederick the Great and you'll find that's true.
I thought I had, but apparently
He ran away in the first battle he ever fought.
What was the most depressing time that you had?
Well, I think about one of the most depressing times was when the word came that President Wilson had died. Well, that wasn't in the war. President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. When President Theodore Roosevelt died, we were I think in camp waiting to come home. That was a very sad occasion. And of course, when some of our people got killed, we always felt badly about it. I had 2 or 3 wounded and 2 killed on the front, and then once in a while one of them would die of an operation or something of the kind. And of course, just like losing one in the family. Those were the saddest experiences, but when you get with the outfit and reminisce, you never think of only the funny things and the good things that happen to you. The bad ones never come up.
Is it true that occasionally when you were meeting with Prime Minister Attlee, the two of you, instead of discussing great, momentous affairs of state, reminisced about the First World War?
Yes, and the same thing with Churchill. I had very pleasant relations with Prime Minister Attlee and with Prime Minister Churchill, with Lord Halifax, and with Sir Oliver Franks, and with several other of the ambassadors. Henry Bonnet of France and Madame Bonnet were most interesting people to talk with on history and the policy of the governments of their various countries. And that was a very pleasant association, one of the pleasantest of the White House experience.
Who was the best conversationalist you have encountered, Mr. President?
Winston Churchill.
And at length, I take it.
Oh, yes. All you have to do is to pull the trigger, and then you can get all the information you want. And it's most happily not bothersome in the slightest. All these people I've mentioned were wonderful people to sit and talk to, and then there are a great many of the Americans who are the same way. Fred Vinson, who was my Secretary of the Treasury and who became the Chief Justice of the United States, and Sam Rayburn, and John McCormick, and any number of senators with whom I associated were most pleasant people to be around. And you could always learn something from any one of them. And if I had kept track of all the good stories they told about my predecessors in the Senate, it would be the best-selling book in the world.
The ability to tell a good story is an essential qualification for a senator, isn't it?
Yeah, well, with his colleagues, it's helpful. But he doesn't want to get the reputation on the stump of being a jokester. If he does, people won't have any confidence in him. The best storyteller in the cloakrooms of the White House, of the Senate, was Alvin Barkley. And I'd say that Nathan Bachman of Tennessee ran him a close second.
Why is it that Southerners or people from the border states are generally the best storytellers?
They have the best sense of humor. You see, when a fellow comes from the Harvard or the New England collegiate influence, he becomes almost a stuffed shirt, but they usually take it out of him when he comes to the Senate. But the good storytellers come from the border states, as you say, and from the South, and the West also.
Why is it that most of the heretics, the radicals, the nonconformists also come from the South?
I've never been able to analyze that, but my first recollection of a nonconformist was Pitchfork Tillman from South Carolina. And then there were several others, Heflin from Alabama and Huey Long from Louisiana. And a great many of those men, I think, were brought into action due to the fact that in some of those states there's a great number of ignorant people who are not black, they're white. And they can be swayed by such actions. That's the only way I can analyze it. We have a demagogue from what is supposed to be the wisest state in the Union. That's Wisconsin. And it's not because the people up there are ignorant, I'm sure, because that produced the two La Follettes, two of the finest men that ever came to the Senate of the United States. And it's a hard thing to analyze, and it's one that's not...
What would you regard as the essentials of a good political speech?
Well, a good political speech must have a core and an objective, and it must be placed in language that the ordinary person can understand. My theory is that the short paragraphs and short sentences and short speeches are the best way to get things over. I've been told many a time that there are no souls saved after the first 20 minutes, and I think it's true.
What, as you look back, was the least successful speech you ever made, the one that disappointed you most?
Oh, there are hundreds of them. I couldn't name one in particular. The first one I ever tried to make was a complete failure.
Where was that?
At Lee Summit, Missouri, when I was running for county judge.
What were you talking about?
I was going to talk about the finances of the county, and when I got up on the platform, I couldn't say anything.
Do you remember what you said?
Nothing. I said absolutely nothing.
You just sit down?
Turned around and walked off. But I got elected. Everybody was in sympathy with me.
No applause when you walked off?
Oh, they yelled at me, of course. They were all my friends.
Let's take 5. Acted just like ordinary people served you in good stead later on in politics?
Yes, it did, for the simple reason that my old grandfather had told me when I was 7 or 8 years old. The church was in the front of the farm, and the Baptists and the Methodists and the Carmelites, the Christians, met there. And he always told me, or he told me 2 or 3 times, that whenever he heard one of his neighbors up in the amen corner of the church praying too loud, he went home and locked his smokehouse. Well, this experience in this drugstore conclusively proved that the old man was correct.
What was your next job?
Well, after I got out of high school, I had a job with the Kansas City Star, what they call wrapping singles. I had to go to work at 11 o'clock and quit at 4. And I got the munificent sum of $7 a week for that job. I was there about 2 or 3 months, and then I got a job as a timekeeper for a railroad contractor who was building a double track on the Santa Fe Railroad down on the Missouri River. And I had that job all summer, and I got $35 a month in board on that job, and managed to save the $35 a month because I didn't have anything to do or any place to go. And after that was over, my father and I took a trip down to South Missouri. He paid the way, but I had enough to get the emoluments that I wanted. And I saw some of the most beautiful country in southern Missouri at that time, which had not been entered or spoiled and was just as it was shortly after the war between the states. And then went with some of the boys to see the Folies Bergère, which I think was better than either one of the other shows that I went to. Then went on down to Nice and spent a very pleasant time at the Hotel Mediterranean, which is run by a woman from Kansas, and it was a very nice hotel. We had a good time there. Went on back to the regiment, and then when the time came to start for home, the new colonel, our colonel had been relieved and gone home. The regular Army colonel who took charge sent me to Paris to collect all the baggage of the officers which had been stored at the American Express Company. And I spent 3 very pleasant days there and went to the French Opera some more and saw some of the downtown Paris, which I visited again this last summer at the same place and sat on the same sidewalk, in the same sidewalk cafe that I'd sat in 1918, and had just as pleasant a time as a man could have, and was not disturbed in any way because the French police and guards sat all around and paid no attention to me. I was finally recognized by a tourist, and then I had to get up and leave.
Well, now we have you demobilized.
While that process was going on, I was elected judge of the county court for the Eastern District of Jackson County with 4 other fine men in the county in the race, or in the primary. One of them was already a county judge. One of them was a leading banker. One of them was a leading contractor, and I was a busted merchant. But I made a campaign on the basis of seeing as many people as possible in the county, and I defeated all 4 of them and became the county judge for the Eastern District. And then I got into a political fight and was defeated in 1924. A nice old man who was a harness maker in Independence and had made a set of harness for our brother and myself when we were kids for a pair of little red goats that we drove to a wagon. He's a very fine man, still alive, and he's most talked about. The reason for having a famous condition is that he defeated a man who afterwards became President of the United States. And then in 1926, I was elected presiding judge of the county court of Jackson County by 16,000 votes. And then 4 years afterwards, I was elected by 55,000. And when I ran for the Senate, I carried the county by 132,000. So they didn't feel badly about the manner in which I'd carried on the business of the county. The county had $2,300,000 worth of protested warrants, which were drawing 6%. Every building in the county was about to fall down. The road system was completely wrecked because it was built for the time of horses and wagons. I succeeded in having bond issues passed, built new buildings, hospital at the Old People's Home, new courthouse in Kansas City, one in Independence, and 335 miles of road on a bond issue of some $15 million, and refinanced the county debt on a basis where it was made a revenue measure and was completely paid off. In 20 years, every single bit of the indebtedness of the county was paid off, and it was solvent. So I knew something about a budget before I went to the Senate and before I became President of the United States.
Well, Mr. President, I must be a bad reporter because somewhere along the line I neglected to ask you when you learned to play the piano.
Well, when I was about of the superintendent of schools in Kansas City, E.C. White, a great educator and a wonderful man. And for 3 or 4 years, I learned a great many of the great piano pieces. In fact, Paderewski himself taught me how to play his minuet.
Did he?
Yes. And the reason for that was that he also was a pupil of Leschetizky, same as my music teacher was, and the same as all the great pianists of the time were. Levine and every one of them, Rosenthal, were all pupils of Leschetizky, the famous Vienna piano teacher. And I got a viewpoint on good music, which was a wonderful asset to me as in an educational way. But when I was about 15 or 16 years old, I decided that it was a sister thing to be a piano player, and I quit. Although I remember the themes of some of the great music that my good teacher was taught me and gave me a good viewpoint of Beethoven and Bach and Chopin particularly I'm fond of, but and all the great operas. But I want to say to you that most of the great operas are as boresome as they can be when you listen to them, but you go there sometimes just to hear one theme that's worth the price of admission. The rest of it's boresome to me, and I'm supposed to be a musician. My daughter became a musician because I was interested in it, and she was educated as a pianist and decided that when she was about 15 that she'd like to be a singer. And I told her on one condition: she could be whatever she wanted, but she must finish her high school education and she must have a college degree before she could start out on a career. Well, she did just that. She finished her high school education and then went to George Washington University and got her degree and got one for the old man at the same time. He didn't have to work for it.
Did you approve the Missouri Waltz as your theme song, so to speak?
I hate to go into the details on that.
We've got you now almost from precinct to president. What do you think of the proposal occasionally advanced that former president
of sitting with those bodies and joining in debate and attending committee meetings, but not having